Hi, my name is Andrei Jikh. Hope you're doing well. Come for the finance and stay for one of the most interesting websites that you'll ever find on the internet called WTF Happened in 1971. And it shows an inflection point that changed the course of economic history forever. And it's partially what's responsible for where we are today. So let me share with you how different life was like in the 70s. I'll show you a ton of data and then I'll help break down exactly what it means and how we got there. So let's jump into a time machine because the 1970s wasn't that long ago. It was the era of simpler times. The era that also gave us the disco, the bell-bottom jeans. It was a time when all the girls aspired to have Farrah Fawcett hair, a time when phones looked like this, calculators looked like that, and Pong was considered a cutting-edge video game. It was the era that gave us movies like Jaws, Star Wars, and it gave us shaggy carpets, classic rock, and pet rocks. No, seriously, it was a trend to buy these pet rocks which came inside these cardboard boxes with holes in them, which also came on a bed of straws. And people paid $3.95 to buy them. At the time, it was considered to be one of the most ridiculously successful marketing campaigns ever designed. And the guy who created the idea became a multimillionaire. Of course, it's just like modern day NFTs, but back then. Also, spending $3.95 in 1971 is the same as spending $28.20 today. So I don't ever want to hear an older person criticize NFTs because you guys bought pet rocks for $30. And what are they worth today? Probably what NFTs will be worth in a few years. I know, you tried to warn us, but see, we're not so different after all. So now let's talk about how much cheaper life was like to live back then, because the data is pretty hard to believe. This is gonna blow your mind, but in 1971, the average person was bringing home a little over $10,500 a year, which works out to be $885 a month. Now, if you wanted to buy a new house back in good old 1971, that would run you about $25,000, which for context is about 2.5 times what the average person was making in a year. Nowadays though, the median income is just a little over $44,000 and the median home value is over $400,000 or nearly 10 times what the average person makes in a year. If you wanted to save for a house in 1971, it took the average person about 2.4 years and today it takes them a little over 7 to do the same. And that's because incomes have not grown at the same pace that homes have. Now, if you wanted to buy a new car in the 1970s, which looked something like these, you could actually save some money and do that because a brand new car cost a little over $3,500, which was about a third of what the average person was making at the time. Nowadays, though, a brand new car will run you $47,000, which is obviously a lot more than what the average income is. Also, if you want to rent a place in 1971, you could do that because it only cost you $150 a month, or about 1/6 of the average monthly income at the time. Nowadays, if you want to rent yourself a 1-bedroom, that will run you $1,750 a month, or for a 2-bedroom, $2,065 a month, which is obviously more than half of what the average monthly income is, a heck of a lot more than 1/6 like it used to be. College is another interesting one because if you wanted to get yourself a college education back in the 1970s when it actually mattered to show your employers that you had a college degree, you could actually do that because you could go to a prestigious Ivy League school like Harvard and pay tuition of only $2,600 a year in comparison to today's $54,000 a year. And you know what's bad when you go to Harvard's own website, under the financial aid tab, the first thing it says is, you can afford Harvard. Food and entertainment was also a lot cheaper too. For example, a movie ticket would run about $1.50 and gasoline cost 40 cents a gallon. Food was also a lot cheaper in every category, and I thought one of the most interesting examples they gave was Campbell's tomato soup, which back in the 70s was 10 cents for a can, which today you can buy at Walmart online for $1.17. But it doesn't even end there. Take a look at the US productivity versus our incomes, because ideally you want a country whose productivity is going up at about the same pace as people's incomes. And that was the case from about 1948 to 1972, and then we deviated. We went up in productivity by as high as 246%, but our incomes went up by almost half. In fact, if we compare the top 1% of incomes versus the bottom 90%, it's kind of interesting because from 1917 to 1970, the bottom 90% of earners were actually growing until 1970, where thereafter it flattened flatlined and declined, but the incomes of the 1% started to grow exponentially after the 70s. We have been on a relentless decline of wages in comparison to the economy's total income too. Also, the consumer price index, which is the thing we use to measure inflation, has historically been relatively stable throughout all our history, from 1775 throughout all the conflicts and all the wars we faced until, surprise, surprise, the 1970s when inflation took off like a rocket ship. Also, the amount of money the country owed as a whole was relatively stable from the 1900s to the 70s until once again something happened in the 70s where our debt took off. We can also see the personal savings rate in the United States go down after the 70s as well, which as a result forced a lot of people to stay more at home with their parents, and we could see the rate of that go up. Even the rate of incarcerations after the 1970s drastically went up. So the question is, WTF happened in 1971 to cause all this? Did someone put something in our water? Did the Russians do it? Is Andrei a secret Ukrainian government spy? Does God have a plan for me? Here's the truth behind what actually happened. It's because of something called the Nixon Shock, which is when President Richard Nixon at the time ended what's called the Bretton Woods Agreement. You see, the United States owned something like 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, which put it in a very powerful position to try something kind of interesting and put itself at the top of what's called the world order. Now, it first started with something called Executive Order 6102, which made it illegal for ordinary people to own gold. This was signed on April 5th, 1933, so if this was the 30s, I wouldn't be allowed to hold this gold. It's not real, but that would be cool. Phase 2 was to sign the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was signed by all the countries of the world in 1944. Under this agreement, countries agreed to exchange their native gold-backed currencies for the dollar, which could also be redeemed for gold. And we made the dollar the standard unit of exchange for all international business. And this made the US extremely powerful because then it allowed us to export our own inflation. And this meant that other countries needed our money. The central banks promised to keep the dollar at 1/35 of an ounce of gold. And this system worked perfectly fine for a little while until we realized, wait a minute. We could print more of these pieces of paper than we actually have gold, and no one will know better. And that's exactly what we did. We started to export our dollars. We started to hand out loans, and that made the US extremely powerful. But that also created problems here at home because as we handed out more and more money, and as countries started to slowly redeem their currencies for gold, we started to run low. Which is why Richard Nixon eventually changed the value of the dollar to 1/38 and then eventually 1/42 of an ounce of gold. And as soon as countries started to realize that, wait a minute, maybe the US doesn't actually have our gold and they're just printing money for fun, which is exactly what we were doing, they all rushed for the exit and they all wanted back their gold. We needed to print more because we needed to solve problems here at home like the Great Depression and the Vietnam War, but as soon as countries realized that, it was too late and we didn't actually have their gold. And that's when Richard Nixon said, never mind. Remember how the dollar used to measure gold? Now it just measures debt. Never mind about that. Who cares? It's just a shiny rock. No one needs it. You're gonna use our fiat money because we said so. And that was the beginning of what happened in 1971. The first part of the problem was the creation of fiat currencies, which are fundamentally very different in how they work than commodity-based ones. Now, fiat means to literally rule by decree. It was put in place by our government, and the only thing that's backing it is the faith of the people. In fact, the only thing our dollar represents today is how much debt is owed. In fact, it literally says that on the dollar. And it's this link between gold and dollars that was disconnected that gave the central banks even more power over money because now they could print an infinite amount of it without having to be responsible for how much gold they had to have. Enter inflation. Inflation is the thing we're trying to solve right now because we printed way too much money to help fix the global pandemic problem, and now there's a lot more money, but the same amount of stuff. And that stuff is obviously becoming more expensive, and that's inflation. So the question is, why don't we go back to having a hard, sound money based on gold? Because obviously you just showed me that the data from the 70s shows a better economy. So let's go back to something with a fixed supply or a money based on gold. And this is one of the biggest debates in all of economics. Which money's better? hard sound money or soft fiat money controlled by the government? Now, gold and crypto people will tell you obviously hard sound money that can't be debased and devalued by the government. But what they won't tell you is that inflation is kind of a necessary evil. One of the hardest, yet simplest questions in all of economics is something that a kid might someday ask you, which is, why do we have to have inflation? Like, why do we have to aim for 2 to 3% inflation per year? This is a smart kid, obviously. Why don't we just never print money again and have a money that's maybe based on gold or maybe Bitcoin? And the more you think about what I'm about to tell you, the more you're gonna realize just how crazy this whole situation is and why it kinda has to be that way. So imagine this extreme. Imagine the government no longer had control over money and it was at a fixed supply forever and ever. Inflation was locked at 0%. Sounds like a really good idea because now a thing will always cost whatever the thing costs forever and ever. But the truth is, inflation could never be at zero because we have access to cheaper labor and manufacturing and globalization and technology, and over time that makes things better and cheaper and more efficient over time. It just does, which means that truly we would have deflation, where the value of everything in relation to the dollar would go down and your dollar would just become more and more valuable. But that would be a huge problem. Imagine you were saving up to buy a TV which cost $1,000. Would you really go out and buy that TV today if you knew that next week it cost $100 less? What if you knew next month it was $400 less and then somehow by the end of the year that same TV cost only $100? Most people probably wouldn't buy it today. They would just wait until that TV became dirt cheap or until they saved just a little bit more money. But that creates the same problem that Bitcoin has, which is that no one wants to spend their Bitcoin because they know that Bitcoin goes up in value over time because it's deflationary. It has a fixed supply of 21 million coins, so everything in relation to Bitcoin goes down in value, so people hoard it and they want to save it. But that creates another problem because as the world expands and the population grows, more and more people need access to money, but they're not going to have it because the people with the current money are just going to hoard it and they're going to keep saving it, which increases the value of the current supply. Okay, so what's the problem with a currency that only becomes more valuable over time, Andrei? It's bad because no one would spend their money and we would not have an economy. We have to artificially force people to go out and spend their money today by running inflation at least 2 to 3% per year. That way, you know that if you wait to buy your dream house next year, it's only going to get more expensive every single year. So you are artificially incentivized to be a consumer today so that we can make better stuff for tomorrow. If that concept did not exist, we would not have stuff that is better. Stuff would always work the same, it would always cost the same, and if we attached the value of money to a commodity like gold, we would create a very rigid system. And rigid systems are not perfect because they're not equipped to deal with expanding populations and times of crises when we need to give money to other people. Now, sometimes our governments are not perfect and they overcorrect and they print way too much and we make fun of our politicians and the cycle continues itself again and again. And that's exactly what's about to happen to our economy right now. We've printed way too much money thanks to the global pandemic, and now we have to reduce the amount of money in the system through something called QT, or quantitative tightening, by reducing the liquidity. So the real goal of money is to balance out the supply alongside the population and the levels of productivity, so as not to create too much money in the system where we get runaway inflation and things become unaffordable like they've become, but not too little amount of money where everyone hoards it and saves it because it's so valuable and we no longer have an economy. So that's the crazy situation we're in now, and which of these systems is better, I think is impossible to tell in a single lifetime, but here's my opinion anyway. The truth behind what happened in 1971 is a lot more complicated than just the Nixon Shock. It was also access to cheap labor, modernization, globalization, deregulation, a focus on corporate greed and corporate profits through share buybacks. It was new technology making things cheaper, and it was new changing social structures with women entering the workforce, and it was so much more than just the decoupling of gold away from the dollar. So don't let me explain exactly what happened in 1971. time because this is just one part of the story. It was the money part, but a lot more happened too. So maybe the real question is not about what happened in 1971, but about understanding that the past was maybe better served by hard money. And maybe now that it's the modern times, we have to evolve and use something that's a little bit more flexible. Sometimes I think that's what we're seeing with crypto. It's the democratization of money away from the government and into the hands of ordinary people to create their own. And maybe it's not about which of those is best, but it's about giving people choice. The ability for us to choose which one is the best to solve the problem at hand. And we'll see those systems collapse too, because we can't create perfect systems. And maybe that's not the point. Maybe money was meant to be a perpetual, ongoing experiment forever and ever. I don't know. All I know is that it's a lot more complicated than people with an agenda to get you to buy Bitcoin or gold will make it seem. And as much as I'd like to finish this video and tell you that Bitcoin is the answer and you should buy it, I don't think it's the only answer. It's just one answer meant as a countermeasure against the government printing more money, which realize isn't always bad. So whatever the perfect balance is, maybe it's too early for us to tell at this moment in history. Or maybe I'm just too dumb to figure it out and I should just stick to making simpler YouTube videos, but either way, it's kind of fun trying to figure it out. As always, have a wonderful rest of your day. Smash the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. Go grab up to $250 worth of free Bitcoin with this link right here. Go grab your free stonks, links are down below, and then go track them automatically with the spreadsheet link down below in my Patreon. Love you, thank you so much for watching this video. I'll see you back here on Monday and Friday, sometimes a Wednesday. I'd love to know your thoughts about which system you think is better. Special thanks to WTF Happened In 1971.com. I'll see you soon, bye-bye.